Sehr schön. Good evening and welcome everyone to the third event in this winter semester's GCSE keynote lecture series. My name, as most of you know, is Jens Kugele. I'm head of research coordination and a member of the GCSE executive board here at our center. And I'm very much looking forward to our event tonight that will allow us to discuss topics, fascinating topics, including the history of culture, Cold War, but also ideology and questions of interdisciplinarity and knowledge construction. As most of you know, our traditional keynote lecture series here at our center offers a prominent platform for established scholars from Germany and abroad. And over the course of the semester, this series provides an opportunity to get acquainted with interdisciplinary perspectives on the study of culture and an opportunity to engage in an exchange with experts in their field. And we are thrilled that we are able to welcome tonight Professor Rósa Magnúsdóttir from the University of Iceland, a scholar whose work bridges contemporary history, international history, and Eastern European history with a special interest in ideology and propaganda, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War period. Thank you very much, Rósa, for accepting our invitation and for joining us tonight. We are particularly grateful that you were able to travel to Gießen despite the current weather conditions at home and the recent volcano activities in Iceland. So good to have you here. This lecture is organized in cooperation with JLU's Colloquium for Eastern European History, and I'm very glad to have two members of this field with me tonight here. Firstly, Professor Nicole Immig, who is one of the principal investigators of our center, GCSE, as well as Professor of Southeast European History here at JLU. And secondly, I'm pleased to welcome Maria Semina, who is a doctoral researcher here at the GCSE and has been very actively engaged in our research group, Europe's East. And before I hand over to my colleagues, allow me to add, as I always do, just a brief note on the format of tonight's event. Directly after the lecture, we invite questions and comments from all of you in the audience. And for those of you who are joining us online, during the Q&A, if you would like to pose a question or make a comment, please just enter a plus in the chat and we'll be happy to add you to the list. However, if you prefer to, you may also just write your question or comment directly in the chat and we'll be happy to read it out for you. Tonight's event will be recorded. The recording, however, is limited, as always, to the audio and the video of our presenters only. The recording does not include any of the Q&A session afterwards, and neither does it include any chat activity or any metadata regarding the participants of this session. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rósa Magnúsdóttir, as well as Nicole Immig and Maria Semina, who are going to share some words of introduction. Thanks.
So, also hello from my side. I'm Nicole Immig, Professor of Southeastern European History, and I've been responsible for the organization of tonight's Oberseminar. My colleague Thomas Bohn is also here, and we are very happy, since this is a joint venture of GCSE and the Oberseminar or Colloquium for Eastern European History, to welcome Rósa Magnúsdóttir. And she's a professor of history at the University of Iceland, as you can see, in the field of contemporary history and international history. And she holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she's the author of a number of books, I would say. One is Enemy Number One, the United States of America in Soviet Ideology and Propaganda in the period from 1945 to 1959. Published from Oxford University Press in 2019, which tells the story of the Soviet cultural and propaganda apparatus and its efforts to control information about the United States in the post-war landscape. She has also written a biography of Icelandic Stalinists. I was very curious to see what is in there. And she has also written numerous articles on Soviet-American cultural relations, the history of cultural Cold War, and community lives. And her current research project includes Soviet-American intermarriage during the late Cold War, and together with Brigitte Beck-Pristet, a project on Soviet-American book diplomacy before Gorbachev. And she's also writing a short book about Reykjavik as a Cold War space, also very interesting to see what's in there. And as I said, she's teaching within the frame of international and global history in Iceland University. And we talked a little bit before this talk, and she said that, or I would say that she's also, biographically speaking, she's also very international, since she's married to a German-French husband. She has 3 daughters, and she recently moved to Iceland from Denmark. Before that, she was in Germany, as well as, not in Norway, no, in Germany. And before that, in the United States. So I think that is also very interesting. And she teaches within the frame of international and global history. And she's also German speaking. So the discussion, you can also pose your question in German. She will answer either in English or in German, or both languages mixed together. And now we will have some words from the PhD candidate, Maria Simina, because it was her initiative that we invited, actually, Rósa Magnúsdóttir, and the floor is also yours to say a few words.
So thank you very much for coming, first of all. I'm very happy to see you, and you are a big inspiration for me. I really enjoyed reading your book, and in many ways it confirms my beliefs in my own theory, so it's also great to see you there and maybe to have a possibility to discuss it. I was mostly impressed by this division between the high Stalinism and Khrushchevian period that you described. And it's just a very interesting topic, and it's also inspiring to me that you are writing about such a wide array of topics overall. As Nicole already mentioned, the marriages, the most recent book about the book diplomacy and so on. It's all very inspiring for women in academia, I believe, to explore such a wide range of topics. And speaking of the cultural Cold War, I'm also dealing with it in a way, because I'm dealing with international Soviet press at the very same period. And this time was not just war in a traditional sense, but also the war of images, which I think you clearly show in your work. So please welcome to the podium, and thank you very much for coming again.
Wow, that is probably the kindest introduction I have ever received, so thank you all. Thank you to Jens Kugele and Nicole Immig and Maria Simina for this invitation. It's really an honor and a privilege to be invited to speak about my work on the cultural Cold War. And you maybe now also know why I'm also interested in topics like intermarriage, because as Nicole told you, I mean, that's kind of something that I also live. But it really is it's really wonderful to get this kind of catalyst to think about one's own research trajectory and maybe ponder some new avenues for it. And from what I can tell, and I've really, just by spending an hour here at this institute, the International Graduate Center for the Study of Culture is really an excellent venue for these kinds of thoughts. So I'm happy to start and share then with you my plan today. So I'm going to divide this up into 3 parts. First, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the cultural Cold War, like what was it and how have I approached it. That's the majority of the second part of my presentation is my own approach to the cultural Cold War. And I'm going to take 2 examples based on the 2 monographs that you've heard a little bit about. Enemy number 1 is the first one, and the second one is the biography of the Icelandic Stalinists. And then what I'll try to do is I'll try to sum up with some lessons learned about the cultural Cold War as a historical phenomenon and cultural diplomacy as an interdisciplinary concept that runs through much of the cultural Cold War research. And I hope that I'll be able to show you as I go through my slides how it is present and how these 2 things, the cultural Cold War and cultural diplomacy, are related. So first of all, I always like to show this picture to represent the cultural Cold War, because it was the ideological conflict that formed the basis for the Cold War. Sometimes it's also talked about as the battle for hearts and minds, But as a research field, the cultural Cold War was originally the domain of historians, but ever since the 1990s, the field has grown exponentially as topics related to the cultural Cold War are now approached from several other disciplinary directions, such as literature, art, and anthropology. And just like the Cold War, which was originally researched mainly just as this bilateral superpower conflict with Soviet-American relations in the foreground, the cultural Cold War had global implications. We see a global web of connections, including transnational relations and entangled narratives, which further complicate the picture of what we understand and research as the cultural Cold War. Especially the role of actors involved in the cultural Cold War has raised several questions about agency and primary sources in general. And additionally, new approaches, access to sources, and theoretical developments have seen historical research branch out into several new subfields. So in my presentation, I'm hoping to work through some of these challenges that have arisen as the field has expanded, and then maybe also think about ways to make the most out of what I also see as the promise of these interdisciplinary approaches. And it's a little bit unclear, but on the photo you see the atomic bombs that are sort of with these signs on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. And then the little arrows, they are sort of there to represent the softer weapons that were used to fight the Cold War, the cultural Cold War. And as I said, the cultural Cold War was at its core about the battle of hearts and minds, which was really just about influencing people. And they did that by appealing to people's emotions, morale, attitudes, and ultimately just wanting to change opinions or win them over to either communism or capitalism in its most basic form. This ultimately links, of course, to psychology, as this is really just about changing human behavior, which is kind of a reason to maybe look at some of these terms like psychological warfare and psychological operations, the psyops as they are sometimes called. So these terms, psychological warfare, was first used in the United Kingdom in the 1920s by J.F.C. Fuller, who was a British military analyst and historian, when he was analyzing the lessons learned during the First World War, especially those related to deployment of new weapons. And psychological operation was first used in an American popular magazine in 1940, but in early 1945, Captain Zacharias from the US Navy employed the term psychological warfare in an operation plan designed to hasten the surrender of Japan. But really it is it's an old technique. Sometimes Genghis Khan, who's on the picture here, is called the true father of psychological warfare, as he is credited with leading huge hordes of horsemen across Russia and into Europe. Agents were planted in advance to spread rumors and other forms of propaganda, exaggerating, for example, the size of his army. And to supplement these psychological operations and the activities related to them, Genghis Khan also used rapid troop maneuvers to confirm the illusion of invincible numbers. So the Mongols managed to create this image of total domination, and their target groups never really believed they were the victims of this kind of astute psychological warfare. So it is just to show the relations to both, a very long past, a long tradition of applying these kinds of methods and gaining knowledge of the enemy and weaponizing knowledge and information is kind of what the cultural Cold War was about. And these kinds of cultural displays and cultural exchange is really not new, but these forms take on a really new form of being during the Cold War, when the superpowers, and of course others, started organizing cultural activities with the goal in mind of impacting others. That is, mixing psychological warfare with cultural activities. And this helped sustain and maintain the ideological conflict of the 20th century. And I sort of try to divide it up. This is based on my work in both of my books, actually, in terms of showing who is involved in the cultural Cold War and thinking a little bit about it as a war technique. So you see the actual weapons, the arrows that are being used and sent over to the enemy. We can also think about them in terms of soft weapons. They are the dancers, the musicians, artists, writers, athletes, intellectuals, and professionals. So we could think of other groups who are fighting this war. They're fighting in battlefields, but they are theaters, they're art galleries, performance halls, stadiums, they're books, they're exhibits, and radio and media. Those are the battlefields of the cultural Cold War. Then we have the generals, and they can be some people who worked as cultural attachés or diplomats, and they could also be the local friends of the superpowers, as I'll show you in my work on the Icelandic Stalinists, or people who just had a lot of power in their position to generate these kinds of cultural activities. Then we have the ground control. Those could be state agencies like the United States Information Agency or the correspondent agency in the Soviet Union, which was called VOX, later renamed and called SOT. The institutional structure in the Soviet Union is really complicated, so I'll spare you. But it could also be embassies, various international governmental organizations, both socialist and non-socialist. If they were socialist, they were always state-sponsored, so there's often a very complicated also institutional structure behind these organizations. Interest groups such as the World Peace Council on the Soviet side or the Congress for Cultural Freedom on the American side. And I mean, I could have listed endless groups like that, but that's just to show that these are the groups that are sort of holding the power on the ground and keeping oversight and communicating with the generals who are then overseeing these activities. And then, because it's the Cold War, we have social control. We have the secret services involved, both the CIA and the KGB, when thinking about the superpowers, and especially when thinking about the Soviet side. We have informers, and we should not forget that the form of visiting in terms of being in a delegation, adhering to a really strict itinerary is also a form of social control and a way of controlling any situation and trying to prevent any unexpected situations from happening. They did not succeed, as we know if you read my book, but they definitely tried, and they tried on both ends, even if we know the story of the Soviet social control more than we do about the American side. So here, this is a really full slide that sort of introduces my research trajectory, just to illustrate that even if I mostly do research on the cultural Cold War, I think the categories and the historiographies that I engage with in my work show the interdisciplinary nature of what I am doing, perhaps even hinting at the complexities of what is behind the label of the cultural Cold War. So I will get to this also a little bit later in my talk, but just to be able to to put my archival research into context, I've had to familiarize myself with very many different historiographies, and they are sometimes even sort of located in different linguistic traditions. As Nicole told you, I mean, I read German and Russian, so I can keep up with, Danish, I can keep up with several different fields, but we also all know that time is not endless, so this can be quite a daunting task. But it's just also to show that the Cold War as a research field is really hidden in a lot of different historiographies, and it's not always easy to have complete oversight over what's been done in any little corner of studying the cultural Cold War. So now, this focus in my own research, as we've mentioned, I'm going to first tell you about the book, Enemy Number One. In particular, I'm going to focus on how one cannot understand the development of cultural relations between the superpowers without understanding local contexts. In this case, it's the Soviet context. And then I'm going to tell you about a book I wrote in Icelandic, which uses the lives of two individuals, a married couple, to address the larger trend of the cultural Cold War. It's a very international story that takes place in Reykjavik, Moscow, Copenhagen, Berlin, Prague, Sofia, Bucharest, and Beijing, just to name a few places, and just to sort of hint at how international the story of two Icelandic Stalinists who are, communicating with organizations all over the world and traveling all over the world just to participate in this ideological struggle, how truly international that is. So one of the central premises of enemy number one, the importance of Soviet ideology, was actually argued very convincingly previously by David Brandenburger. He claimed, and I quote, that ideology is best addressed from three different perspectives relating to its production, projection, and popular reception, end quote. In his study of actually pre-war Soviet ideology and propaganda, Brandenburger offers a broad account of how these three facets of ideological indoctrination were out of balance, as exemplified in what he calls the failure of the party hierarchy to popularize its ideological worldview. So ultimately, for indoctrination to work, there has to be a balance between the three parts. And in the post-Second World War period that I study, the first part, production, was pretty well done. The Soviet Union actually knew how to produce propaganda. Sometimes the second part, but especially the third part, was often a failure. And I argue that the Soviet Union, which, by the way, was often labeled the propaganda state, which indicates great successes in the cultural Cold War, was actually a failed propaganda state, basically because it relied on fear and persecution, which was detrimental to success in this very area. I'll show you here the main actors in enemy number one. And as Marina mentioned, it is sort of organized around these two periods, late Stalinism and then the early Khrushchev period. So Stalin and Khrushchev are always there in the background with their narratives and their policies. And of course, then correspondingly, we have Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and Nixon on the other side. But it's actually a really diverse group that I focus on because I worked with so many different categories of sources. So you see here that I looked at what the creative class was doing in terms of producing propaganda materials, writers, playwrights, screenwriters, directors, actors, all kinds of people. And I looked at the popular reception, which means that I was focusing on how Soviet citizens actually perceived of the United States of America in this period. So I had workers and farmers and students' perspectives. And this is not easy when you're dealing with a totalitarian state, to try to investigate what people actually thought about the number one enemy. And I also have managers and staff in party and state bureaucracy. So you see just a few of the organizations that I was dealing with. So as I said, I worked with very many different categories of sources, which I think is actually one of the keys to getting a multifaceted picture, because one category of sources dealing with just one of these institutional structures is often used as the basis for studies, especially in cultural diplomacy, which often provides a very limited view of the larger implications of the cultural Cold War. So I've hinted at some of the things in relations to my methods and how they connect to the sources. The source categories are based on the three levels of indoctrination in a totalitarian state. So in order to investigate the production and projection, I looked at the work of what the Soviets called, quote-unquote, ideological workers, in terms of organizing cultural relations with the United States. To figure out the popular perceptions, or the reception, I tried to work around the difficulty of measuring reception and attitudes in a totalitarian state, by using, for example, the rehabilitation files of those who had been convicted for anti-Soviet behavior, according to Article 5810 of the Soviet Criminal Code. So analyzing them allowed me at least to show what the Soviet government defined as anti-American attitudes during the 1940s and 1950s. There are so many complications with using these sources, I won't go into them, but at least I can always say, I mean, just by convicting people for these types of attitudes, I can at least defer something about the fear of the state, that these were inappropriate attitudes. I'm not saying that people actually had them, although I think, we can imagine that some probably did. So the reactions of the government, both the political persecution and the jamming, tell us a lot about the fear of subversion in Soviet society. And even if Soviet-American cultural relations increased dramatically after Stalin died, the political persecution did not stop, which is actually one of the interesting conclusions in my work, if I may say so myself, because it indicates that any kind of cultural relations or cultural exchanges were always a very sensitive issue in the Soviet Union. I mean, of course, it was dramatically less than it was during Stalin times, but it did not disappear. It was always considered suspicious to be interested in the West, which is pretty much a way of saying, that in the Soviet Union, everything was defined in adversarial terms, in art and in life. Soviet citizens were judged based on their loyalty, and that goes back to the Civil War, collectivization, the Second World War, and finally the Cold War. The question was always, as David Cott phrased it so nicely, where did you stand, comrade, and how did you behave during any of these events? Like, were you on the wrong side or were you on the right side? So Soviet society was really ridden with suspicion and fear, and it took a certain kind of perseverance to just survive in this society. This is all just to sort of understand the background for the research. And here you saw this picture also in the advertisement for the talk. So during the Stalin era, I always like to show this visual just to describe the dominant narrative about the United States. So the ideological workers, the writers, the playwrights, the circus skits performers, I mean, pretty much anybody who was doing anything related to culture or dissemination in the Soviet Union, they were charged with creating this kind of propaganda. So it says here, freedom the American way, and you see on the high rise, it says Wall Street, which is just, Wall Street, it immediately means evil capitalists. The same with a dollar sign that you see, it just sort of, that is just a synonym for evil capitalists. The police officer with a bulldog face is a very familiar trope in this kind of propaganda. And then they go through sort of making a mockery out of American values. Top left is the freedom of print, like press freedom, and it's Hearst sitting on a bag of money, again the dollar sign. Then it's the freedom of opinion, and the man's behind bars. Freedom of the individual, and then freedom of association and gathering, which is then, armed police, obviously corrupt because they're paid with the dollar sign there, and they're breaking up a demonstration with red flags, which is probably no coincidence. And I mean, the death of Stalin really did have an impact, especially it had a major impact on developments in the Soviet Union. So things started to change really quickly. He died on March 5th in 1953. The funeral was held on March 9th in 1953, and then, of course, he was reburied in October 1961. But that's a different side of the story. But I mean, in the Soviet Union, there was remarkable change just even a few weeks later. One of my favorite examples in my intermarriage research is that 3 weeks after Stalin died, the divided married couples who were not allowed to meet because of visa restrictions, and there was a ban on marriage with foreigners during late Stalinism. That was all lifted just 3 weeks after he died. And then we can look at the opening of the Gulag or many other cases where things happened really, really fast. But one of the first indications that things were starting to change internationally after Stalin is that in 1955, Soviet ideological workers, they start writing about a quote-unquote revival of cultural relations with the United States. And one of the groups that I follow in my book are the Elbe veterans, those soldiers who met on the Elbe here in Germany in April 1945. The meeting was always celebrated as it signaled the end of the Second World War, and the veterans had been trying to meet ever since, but only succeeded after 10 years of trying in 1955 when they met in Moscow. And this photo here is actually taken in 1958 when they met in the US for the first time. And this is at the Soviet embassy under the gaze of Stalin, who, by the way, was then removed from most public buildings in the Soviet Union, but was still there presiding in the Soviet embassy in Washington. I want to emphasize here the importance of the Great Patriotic War, as the Second World War was called in the Soviet Union, in the failure of controlling people's attitudes about the number one enemy, because it proved very difficult for them to pivot the image from friend to foe. It was easy, for example, to unify Soviet people against Nazi Germany during the Second World War, but it turned out to be much more difficult to turn the former ally into enemy number one. And especially in 1958 and then 1959, people really embraced the sort of opening of the possibility to talk about the former ally openly and even to talk about the alliance, because that had completely disappeared from public discourse during the late Stalin era. Then I want to also talk about how the thaw in the Soviet Union, this internal thaw that then in 1955 is starting to show on the international arena with the Geneva summit and, as I said, the revival of cultural relations with the United States. Then the thaw also led to negotiations with foreign countries about cultural exchanges. And in 1958, following agreements with, for example, France and Britain, the Soviet Union signed a bilateral agreement with the United States. And it was an agreement on film, dance, music, tourism, technology, science, medicine, scholarly research exchange in general. And this agreement was then renegotiated every 2 to 3 years during the Cold War. The title of the agreement was modified, and it often took months to renegotiate. But this is, for example, one of the reasons there were so many Soviet American marriages during the Cold War, because when you put students in dormitories, they fall in love and get married, which created an international hazard. It was really a crisis for especially the Soviet government, because they did not want the spouses to leave, and they created blocks for international partners to marry. So there was no problem to get married. It became a visa, international crisis because of visa restrictions. But that's a totally different story. I wasn't going to talk about that at all today, but it's tempting to hint at it as well. And also just when these exchanges now, the cultural relations have been put into this exchange form, it's also just important to note that the United States partnered a lot with the private sector. And I mean, we can think of so many American cultural activities during the Cold War that relate directly to private initiatives. But the Soviet Union relied only on governmental agencies in executing this agreement. They tried to often have the appearance of this being grassroots initiatives, but they never were. There was always a governmental agency behind them. And yeah, this is this is at the signing, like the Soviet ambassador Zarubin is on the left-hand side shaking hands with William Lacy, who was special assistant to Secretary of State Dulles as they met and started this discussion. And maybe just as a side note, the last agreement of the cultural exchanges between the Soviet Union and the US was still in effect when the Soviet Union collapsed. It had been negotiated in 1985 and was still in effect in 1991. And in the 1990s, Russia and the US negotiated a new deal. It was called the Memorandum of Understanding in the fields of culture, education, and the media. which was terminated by Order number 1350 on May 28th in 2022 as a part of Putin's reaction to what he claims is the West's cancellation of Russian culture. But that is another story. But that is just also to say that these cultural exchange agreements, they survived the whole Cold War from 1958, and as of 2022 is the first time in a long time that there is no such official agreement between the two governments, and then it was terminated from the Russian side. The concept of nylon curtain was not new in the late 1950s, but the exchange agreement had considerable impact on creating more traffic through the Iron Curtain. So according to the American practitioner of the American cultural and public diplomacy, Yale Richmond, the three watchwords of the exchanges were equality, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. So the two countries were to treat each other as equals, approximate reciprocity was to be sought in the various exchanges, and benefits to the two countries should be comparable. This was always a little bit difficult to navigate, especially in terms of like how many people wanted to go to the Soviet Union, how many people wanted to go to the US, but this was still what everybody was trying to live up to. And of course it was, probably more people wanted to go to the US than were allowed to go, but still more than 50,000 Soviet citizens visited the United States under the cultural agreement. And in 1966 alone, just to give an example of 1 year, nearly 1.5 million foreigners arrived in the Soviet Union. Not all of them based on the cultural exchanges. It's difficult to have these matching numbers. But it's just sort of to indicate that the profound isolation of Soviet citizens from the West that was often talked about, especially during and maybe immediately after the Cold War, has often been exaggerated. And a lot of people also visited the Soviet Union, both on the exchanges but also as tourists. And it has, of course, been pointed out that the Soviet Union welcomed tourists for a mix of commercial and political reasons. The state also wanted to use the opportunity to educate foreigners about the value of the Soviet way of life. But ultimately the point here is just that the Iron Curtain was always porous, and from what I've told you, I hope you also realize that the time of least interaction, which is the time of late Stalinism, was actually relatively short. It's about, from 1947 to 1955, and as of 1955, when they have this revival of cultural relations, and then with the negotiation of the exchanges, we see an increase, and we see a steady flow. But again, was easy. It was not easy to travel, but it was possible for some, and it was more porous than many people have actually thought. The first, most notable outcome of the exchange agreement in 1958 were the two mutual national exhibitions. We had a Soviet exhibition in New York and an American exhibition in the Soviet Union in the summer of 1959. So here are some of the pictures from the American exhibition in Moscow, which has both received, at the time it received more attention. It has also received much more attention in the research than the Soviet exhibit in New York. But it is something that is ingrained in the memory of people of a certain age in the Soviet Union, and then Russia and the post-Soviet space as an event that really opened up the world to a lot of people. We can talk also about the 1957 Youth Festival, which had a huge impact as well. But the American exhibit, it was open for 6 weeks, and it had the famous model house with a model kitchen. Actually, the first picture, which I'm sure you all recognized, was from the famous spontaneous kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev. And the American exhibit is also sort of what coins, after the International Expo in Brussels in 1958, and then these exhibits travel around during the Cold War. But the 1959 exhibit is the point in time where we can say that the Cold War the Cultural Cold War is really about sort of issues like comfort, consumption, and convenience, and we see women in particular being targeted as a group that might be converted because, if technology takes care of all the housework, you have time to drink a cup of coffee and read the newspaper. This is actually the counter exhibition that Khrushchev opened at VDNH right around the time when the American exhibit was opened. This is also in Moscow. It was the exhibit. The exhibit area had existed for a long time, but the new exhibit was called Exhibition of Achievements of the National Economy, and that was all part of Khrushchev's project to showcase socialism, to showcase the accomplishments of the Soviet Union, and to counter the overall positive impression the American exhibit was making on the Soviet public. So they're always working, within their own country to control and sort of manipulate people's experience of the other. And Khrushchev wanted to be seen as the icebreaker of the Cold War. This is actually a picture of the nuclear icebreaker ship called Lenin, and Khrushchev was also aligning himself with Lenin and the policy of peaceful coexistence. And then ultimately Khrushchev is shown here, visiting a farm in Iowa in the United States and looking at his favorite thing, which is corn. He's also been called Comrade Corn. And I can mention it, you'll think about it later, and there's also articles that have been written about corn diplomacy, which refer to Khrushchev's fascination with corn in the US and the Soviet Union. So this is the way that he's dealing with both trying to open up and show off, but also, tell people that the other side. So on the day of the opening of the American exhibit, it was Lenin, the icebreaker, that was on the front page of Pravda. And then, on page 3 or 4, they, gave negative reviews of the exhibit. I mean, there's just always a sort of a way to sort of hold up these two different narratives at the same time. So here's a summary of some of the underlying currents of the Cultural Cold War as investigated in my book, Enemy Number 1. I've talked about these two narratives. Under Stalin, there's a very explicit anti-American propaganda. It's called, the reports describing it are just called the anti-American campaign. In literature and the arts, in the media, just everywhere in daily life, there are serious persecutions. Under Khrushchev, peaceful coexistence with the enemy is possible, and there is this revival of cultural relations, but there is still some persecution. And the authorities persecuted ordinary citizens if their opinions about the United States of America did not conform to official Soviet propaganda. And what this means is that under the 5810 clause in the Soviet Criminal Code, people could be sent up to the Gulag or in exile for up to 10 years. So there was I'm not going to talk too much about it, but there are striking similarities to the legal environment in today's Russia with how this was actually done during the Soviet time. And also, as I hinted at with the Elbe veterans, the importance of the memory of the wartime alliance in terms of, creating and then failing to sustain an image of the United States as the number one enemy because they had been allies that worked together, and it was difficult for people to not be able to even talk about these experiences. So when Khrushchev opened up for it by allowing the US to put up an exhibit in Moscow, by going to the United States himself on an official visit, he was greeted with a lot of sort of eagerness from the Soviet population. It was like, finally, we're allowed to talk about this. Like, this was an important part of our wartime experience. Now I'm going to go over to the other monograph, the other project that I'm going to briefly introduce. This is a study of an Icelandic married couple. And in typical Icelandic tradition, I just put their first names up here. We always refer to everyone by first name. But the man's name was Kristinn Andrésson. He was born in 1901 and died in 1973. And then Þóra Vigfúsdóttir was born in 1894 to 1980. And as you see here, they were married for about 50 years until Kristinn died. So this is a story of a wife and a husband, of a woman and a man, but mostly they were intellectuals and they were communists. And they were devoted Stalinists until they died. So 1956 with the secret speech and with the invasion of Hungary, didn't matter, it just, everybody else was wrong. They were right. And in 1968, when the Prague Spring was crushed, they were actually in Moscow and in the Soviet Union. And I mean, the descriptions of that is I just saw how people from the party came to the sanitarium where they were staying as the luxury communists that they were, and explained to them, the Pravda narrative. Like, I mean, it's actually seeing exactly how indoctrination worked. And they lived really interesting lives. I mean, that's why like this monograph is like double the size of the other one, but I'm not gonna talk as long about it anyway. I mean, Kristinn studied literature, Icelandic literature, Nordic literature, actually in Kiel and then in Berlin, where he saw Hitler, cheered by Goebbels, give a speech in the early 1930s, but was extremely turned off by that spectacle, and returned to Iceland in February 1932, and then became chairman of the pre-war Icelandic Friends of the Soviet Union Society. Then 2 years later, in 1934, he and Þóra were married, and they went to the Soviet Union for the first time together, and were completely in awe of what they witnessed there. And then it sort of just takes over and defines their lives. So both of them are activists, and they're really, prolific writers. Þóra worked as a homemaker for most of her life. Kristinn, he was a publisher and editor at the Socialist Press, which got a lot of money from especially Moscow, but also from East Berlin. They actually paid for a building in downtown Reykjavik because he went on so many begging trips to the east. He was a member of parliament for the Socialist Party during the Second World War. They were both in positions as chairs and secretaries and contact people for numerous international socialist organizations, the peace organizations, the youth organizations, the Friendship Society. So they were in contact with, Vox and SOT and Interdisciplinary and the World Congress for People, the Women's International Democratic Foundation, etc., etc. They were also involved with not just the Icelandic Soviet Friendship Society, which the Icelandic acronym of that is MIR. They were also involved with the Romanian, the Czechoslovak, the Bulgarian, Albanian, and Chinese friendship societies. So the list just went on. One of the interesting things in the story is that after 1956 and the policy of peaceful coexistence, Kristinn finds that the Soviet Union is getting too weak, so he just turns to China and goes to China in 1959, and everything's perfect in China. I mean, it's just sometimes I felt like, this is so too crazy to be true. But this is truly a history of a generation with transnational networks that are, they are living and sort of completely indoctrinated by this ideology. They're also, using all of their free time. So they carry with them a great sense of duty, idealism, and it's all, based on these intertwined lives of these two individuals. And I could do this because I had so many different sources to work with. Actually, there's an incredible amount of sources, both in Iceland, Russia, and Germany, and they both, being the intellectuals that they were kept diaries. And because they traveled so much, often together, but often apart, there's a lot of correspondence between the two of them, and then just with all of these different organizations, ranging from the 1930s until the 1970s. So this is of course a goldmine for an historian who's interested in these kinds of relations, and it's not easy to come across this. And one of the things that was interesting about the sources is that they were aware of, they donated them to an archive themselves. So, and with the words that hopefully at some point people can see that we were right. And I mean, and then I thought, okay, I mean, they weren't. And actually, one of the sources that they left behind was their last apartment, which they donated to the university because they were socialists and didn't believe in private property. And I actually stayed in that apartment because it was rented out to researchers. It's been sold now, but I managed to stay there for several periods of time. And the first shopping mall in Iceland was built right in front of that apartment. And I felt like that was kind of the irony of how their lives went. Like they know you were actually really wrong about everything. And the temple of capitalism is right in front of their old apartment, which had some of their old furniture, some of their books, as I had on the previous slide, and a lot of them were like the collected works of Marx and Engels, so nobody had wanted to keep these books. They did not have children, so they could just pretty much leave everything there. You see piles and piles of the Little Red Book, and in several different languages, souvenirs, LPs. I mean, I also used some oral sources, not very many, because the written sources were just so abundant. And there are visual sources, obviously. And I tried to incorporate in this biography some of Latour's agency of objects, because it was kind of like creating an atmosphere, in tiny 20th century Reykjavik, but with this very international component. So this is an area that I've been really interested in, and as I hinted at, like actors and agency related to the Cold War. And I argue that, looking at these types of individuals allows us to better understand, all sides. That's the production, the projection, and the popular perception. But it is only possible because their sources are so rich. So I could actually ask questions like, what attracted European intellectuals like Kristen and Thora to communism? What sustained their idealism and support for the communist ideology? And as I said, they were treated as royalty, like the red carpet everywhere they went. They spent, long periods of time in Sochi or at the Black Sea, and they just had, they were treated, because they were so valuable for this overall propaganda campaign. I don't know if it's, I kind of take it for granted, but Iceland was really strategically important during the Cold War. So the Soviet embassy in Iceland was actually one of the largest embassies in the Western world, because Iceland is a founding member of NATO, and starting during the Second World War, it was strategically located. So the Soviets always had a really strong interest in Iceland and Icelandic society. So as I said, they never stopped believing in the Soviet Union. They, not after the invasion of Hungary, not after the crushing of the Sprague Spring. And this whole of course the Soviets wanted them to be loyal to the Soviet Union, but the fact that they remained Stalinist until the day they died actually did cause some frustration in Moscow. The Soviet ideological workers, they kind of objected to their outdated understanding of Soviet cultural life. And in the sources, I see, how the cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy in Iceland takes a vodka bottle and spends, 7 hours at their home just with the two of them, and then writes an 8-page report on, some of their outdated opinions and sort of getting things out. Like, it is actually seeing in motion how all of this works in a local context. But then, he becomes more Catholic than the Pope, which is also really interesting when looking at the Soviet Union. So ultimately, this book could be something like a case study of the cultural Cold War. It's just that it's so long. I'm not sure that I will ever manage to translate it into another language, but at least I get to talk about it because it's written in Icelandic. Because it can draw out these facets of the Cold War. Like, they're admirers of the Soviet Union in close cooperation with International Front Organization. They're involved in the organization, planning, financing, and the communication. And they are really anti-American in all of their views. They're against the presence of the US military in Iceland, and they saw American culture as decadent and damaging to Icelandic national culture. But they also see the struggle when the Soviet embassy and these Soviet organizations are sending them films which are shown with, explanations in brochures or with the subtitles in Danish or English. But Kristin especially is really frustrated because people just don't read Russian. You can send us as many of these magazines that you want, but people just can't read them. So that's, of course, it's an uphill struggle for the Soviet Union. For us, the United States always had maybe a bit easier. So that's the Kristin and Þóra story, quite briefly. Maybe because Marina, you were saying you're working with journalists, and Kristin was actually depicted. He met Boris Pahlivoi, and he called him a capitalist communist, which is something I use because Kristin just believed that selling socialist books to workers would change the world. And just to give you a glimpse into Þóra's mind, she was the avid diary writer. She wrote after Hungary in October 1956. Then one of my favorite quotes in her diary is, "It is no fun being a socialist in Reykjavik these days." Because they were going to the reception at the Soviet embassy, and people were protesting, the revolution, the celebration of the revolution, which is right around this time, and then people are throwing eggs at them, and they're like, "This is no fun." But she did continue. Okay, I'm getting closer to finishing here, but if you think about the lessons learned in my research, so here's a quote from a 10-year-old article by Federico Romero, which I think is still quite relevant, where he pointed out that it can be very difficult to fit the actors of these local and national, and even I would say international conflicts, to fit their agency, culture, and politics into a single interpretative framework embracing a global dimension. So I would say this is what I've tried to do in all of my work, although it's for others to decide if I succeeded. And one of the things that I often my feeling about the work that I do is that sometimes it is maybe a bit too complex. It can be difficult to tell you, I've been going on and on about these narratives, but I find, boiling it down to that one elevator pitch can be quite difficult. But this, I think, gets to what I have been trying to do. And now I'm going to show you maybe, and start thinking more about the concept of cultural diplomacy with these, I've divided it up into maybe 4 lessons learned. So the first lesson is who's in charge. And I find that very often people forget to look behind the scenes when they're trying to draw out actions of cultural events. And especially the cultural diplomacy concept, with an emphasis on diplomacy, is complicated by a debate about how important the involvement of the state, or even just state policy and agencies, is in executing cultural activities, or whether it can be carried out without reference to state policy, for example, by civil society organizations or independent cultural institutions. And this is particularly Jessica Ginau Hecht and Mark Donfried, who have been heavily, especially Mark Donfried with the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin. But they claim that the involvement of such non-state actors raises the question of whether cultural diplomacy is really diplomacy at all. And perhaps my point here is that maybe we just need to be more clear in differentiating between cultural relations in general and then cultural exchanges, which are often based on official agreements involving the state, and cultural diplomacy. And here, I think, the reason you have the Red Army Choir, I just like the question of who's in charge. And here the conductor is in charge, and the Red Army Choir was one of the most important soft weapons that the Soviet Union had during the Cold War. But, he's obviously in charge of the singers, but who's in charge of this operation, and how does it work? We need to be looking in depth at what is behind these events. And we need to be really clear about the involvement of the state versus what was sometimes made to, appear as a non-state involvement, but in the Soviet case was almost always state involvement. But on the American side, one of the first and earliest examples in looking at this question of who's in charge was Francis Stoner Saunders, who wrote the book Who Paid the Piper, which I'm sure some of you know. It came out in 1999, and it looked at the role of the CIA in Cold War cultural diplomacy. And maybe some of you know that this particular book has been discussed at great length in a recent popular podcast. It's about whether or not the CIA wrote the Scorpion song Wind of Change, which has been dubbed as the soundtrack to the East European revolutions in 89 and 90. I'm not going to spoil it for you. You just have to listen to it. It's a very entertaining series, and it goes through the cultural Cold War from this perspective. But I mean, maybe the CIA was writing the Scorpions song. So who is really in charge? Never know. Okay, lessons learned number 2. So the performers are the soft weapons, again, that we talked about, the dancers, the musicians, the artists. We could even think maybe if we go back to the first, one of the first slides with the ground control, where we had like the state agencies and the Secret Service, etc. So we need to really be looking at the actual performers and participants in organized programs and recognize that they have agency. And here I am also thinking about the people like Kristin and Thora and their agency. I mean, you can say they are puppets in a bigger spiel, but through their sources I also see some of the internal struggles and their interactions with, all these different levels, like local, Soviet, and more international, and I mean even in between, like regional, Nordic, also just urban and rural in Iceland. They're all different kinds of relations there showing agency. And I also just don't want to forget the spatial dimension here, as I talked about the battlefields, like the theaters and the galleries and the performance halls are also really quite important. And the third lesson is in terms of reception, how even if this is the most difficult part of the equation, this focus on audience and impact, all of my favorite photos from the cultural Cold War show the audience. It is so rare that you actually have a picture of what is going on outside of the stage. So this is at the National Theatre in Iceland, and you see, it was always packed. This is in the late 1950s. I don't remember exactly, but this is a Soviet performance in the theater. So the spatial dimension is important for also trying to show the impact of the activities, show the audience and show the impact. Because if we don't try at least to focus on the audience and impact, we're left with a very speculative story of the perceived success, such as, the hindsight evaluation of that the United States won the cultural Cold War, which may be true, but we can better understand what it was that they did right and the Soviets did wrong if we understand also the reception side of the story. And then finally, lessons learned number 4. I want to take a look at the cultural in cultural relations, cultural exchanges, and cultural diplomacy. So as this group knows very well, culture is already a very highly complex notion. It has come to encompass a wide range of phenomena, from the high arts to the everyday habits and values of particular groups in human society. Yet there is neither consensus about the nature and purpose of cultural diplomacy, nor about its legitimate actors. And this has caused academics to apply a whole new range of concepts to certain activities of the Cold War that are often very useful, but sometimes a bit misguided. And you see here, the impulse if you're talking about something that relates to culture, cultural Cold War, cultural relations, and cultural diplomacy, it's not just the arts, it's also radio, television, exchange programs, students, language education, exhibitions, translations. There's a whole field of just looking at the role of translators during the cultural Cold War. So people have started going down this road of maybe it's safer to talk about arts diplomacy and dance diplomacy and music diplomacy, etc., which is all good and fine. I mean, absolutely. Then we also go into something like medical diplomacy, sports diplomacy, or ping pong diplomacy, which is very focused. I mean, on this one event during the Cold War. So all of this is really quite fine, but I can see some of the pitfalls with doing this. All of the phenomena listed here can be studied under the umbrella of the cultural Cold War, but the risk is that the focus becomes too narrow, and I wonder if the term cultural Cold War is more or can be more inclusive than cultural diplomacy and all the labels that have come to also denote the phenomenon that we are dealing with, the cultural Cold War. I mean, I just often see these labels being applied to contexts where maybe the investigator, the researcher has found a really fascinating core group of sources, but is kind of missing the bigger picture of going into different categories. And but I mean, I love these. I mean, they are great in conference programs and in paper titles and chapter titles. And actually, I took all of these just from looking through the conference programs of the New Diplomatic History Network, conferences that I've attended, and I mean, excellent research and work being presented there, no doubt. But it's just sort of to show you that people are sort of finding a corner of the cultural Cold War. This can also be applied to activities outside of that framework, but they often are ascribed to precisely the cultural Cold War. And it just goes back to the multidisciplinary nature of, cultural diplomacy, which goes beyond the cultural Cold War, but also the study of the cultural Cold War as a field. So I come at it from the field of history, but I've had to also, as you saw maybe in the first, the slide that sort of shows you my personal trajectory, but here are also just some other, fields of study, academic subjects that also engage both cultural diplomacy and often touch upon elements of the cultural Cold War. And finally, maybe looking at some of the challenges of interdisciplinary knowledge creation. So the research on the cultural Cold War originates in different academic departments with various archival, analytical, theoretical, and linguistic traditions. The research is then presented at specialized academic conferences and published in even more specific academic journals. And therefore it ends up existing in parallel universes, perhaps recognizing the existence of each other, but too rarely engaging with one another. So the journals depicted here, that's one of the easy corners of looking at a historiography or an academic field developing, because it's diplomatic history, it's diplomatica, very focused on just historical research, and then the Hague Journal of Diplomacy and Statecraft, which look more at history, IR, diplomacy, all different kinds of schools, and this is an easy corner of this literature. In the time since I started studying the Cold War, I have read countless papers and books in manuscript and published, attended various conferences, and listened to numerous presentations. So often the Cold War is background rather than focus, which is fine, but too often the study is limited to English language sources, so we have really wide and dispersed literature on the American side of the cultural Cold War. But I would argue, at least based on what I'm seeing in many new publications, is that field has sort of reached its limits because of the limits of just focusing on the American side of the story. So we need more global, international focused studies, and we need definitely more language training for people to be able to do the archival work. So this is definitely a vibrant and a fun research field, but I see some challenges as the field grows. Again, I see people working in parallel worlds, not aware of work being done in other academic fields, and this impacts the training of junior researchers and creates redundancies in the work, as I'm sort of seeing a little bit in the American historiography. And that, to me, sometimes inhibits the advancement of the field. So, we need to be aware of this development and think about how to change it, but I wanted to end on a positive note. As I think about how this field has been developing for the past 30 to 40 years, I actually think there are two very positive outcomes of the way the historiography is developing, however slowly. So I've seen the breadth of the field expand as more and more studies focused on the international or global elements of the cultural Cold War, shying away from the Eurocentrism or USA-centrism that all too often defines the Anglo-American historiography of the Cold War. And with increased focus on non-traditional forms of diplomacy, anything from dinner diplomacy to any kind of, there's a space diplomacy that deals with outer space, so there's just all kinds of diplomacies. With a focus on the many different actors, the field actually moved away from the history of just white middle-class male political actors, with an increased focus on women, students, youth, and children, and other groups that had been neglected until then. So it's actually up to us to continue working through the complexities of the sources, highlight the various actors, and to initiate more interdisciplinary dialogue about the cultural Cold War. So that was it from me. Thank you very much. Again with the audience. Thank you.